Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, Zimbabwe goes to the polls. What kind of campaign coverage did they get there? Turkey, media self-censorship, and how writing about it can be a career-limiting exercise. The verdict comes in the Bradley Manning case. Then Wikileaks accuses the White House of national security extremism. And
calculating route.
The GPS device that knows its way around the inside of the car.
What is so interesting about that phone?
That's our web video of the week. When voters went to the polls in Zimbabwe's presidential elections this past week, the fight for the airwaves intensified. ZBC, the Zimbabwean Broadcasting Corporation, is the country's only domestic TV channel. It has been accused of backing incumbent President Robert Mugabe throughout the campaign, endorsing Mugabe's claims of a landslide victory, and dismissing the opposition's counter-narrative that the vote was a sham. The campaign featured large-scale media censorship. Community radio stations have been restricted. Journalists have been threatened. However, in the information age, media clampdowns are not easy to enforce. The most critical voices are media outlets located beyond the country's borders. There's a fledgling TV channel now available to Zimbabweans beaming in from South Africa, challenging the version of events put forward by President Mugabe and the coalition government headed by his ZANU-PF party. There's a whistleblower who calls himself Baba Jukwa, thought to be a senior government official. He's shaking things up via an anonymous Facebook page. But when push comes to shove, as it often does in Zimbabwean elections, the millions of voters in rural areas can make all the difference, and they depend mainly on the state broadcaster for their information. Our starting point this week is the capital of Zimbabwe, Harare.
Equal airplay to all political parties contesting in the forthcoming harmonized elections.
There's nothing wrong with propaganda.
This time the people are going to reject these 10 codes.
Propaganda, the word itself, emerged from the Catholic Church. It comes from propagate. You propagate your beliefs.
The message now, which is what the president is saying about these coming elections, is to say to the people, you have betrayers.
You know, the word propaganda is one of the most unfortunate words in the world. Just like love, you know, people abuse those words.
5 voices on the state of the media in Zimbabwe. The senior editor of a government-owned newspaper, President Mugabe's former deputy minister of communications, and the journalists in exile, one working in print, another in radio, both reporting on Zimbabwe from the UK, and one working for First TV, the new channel based in South Africa. First TV broadcasts from an undisclosed location. No one seems to know who's funding it, and the man in charge isn't sane. He is Andrew Chadwick, a former aide to Mugabe's political rival, Morgan Tsvangirai, of the MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change.
We are a group of Zimbabweans broadcasting Zimbabwean content to Zimbabweans. And in that, our policy is very clear in that we are apolitical. We do not support any political party at all. And we are open to all politicians to use this power of television to reach Zimbabweans with their message.
Well, First TV is the new kid on the block in terms of Zimbabwean new media. They are broadcasting from South Africa. They've only just started just before the elections, providing TV coverage on free-to-air satellite for Zimbabweans. We don't know who funds them. We're not entirely sure. As you can imagine, ZANU-PF has a panic, has immediately said that they're pirates and that they're illegal. But most Zimbabweans have really welcomed having independent television for the first time in decades in Zimbabwe.
Obviously, it's a foreign-funded television channel, because the gentleman that is managing that, who is managing that channel, used to be Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai's media advisor. He's either British or American. You can't open a channel because there are elections. It doesn't matter. What is critical is the message that you give to the people.
There's nothing wrong with giving people a diversity of channels to listen to, but there's everything wrong if those channels are being sponsored by outsiders with a political objective. Foreigners have no business broadcasting into Zimbabwe, circumventing the laws. We have laws.
There's nothing wrong with Tsvangirai having his own TV station. ZANU-PF uses the state broadcaster for that.
Analysts have predicted that ZANU-PF is heading for a landslide victory.
I would like to see ZANU-PF having their own TV station. That's fine, there's no problem with that. If individual political parties want to fund radio stations, fine. But let's use our state broadcaster as a true state media and not as for partisan purposes.
The Listening Post covers broadcasters all over the world, and it would be hard to find a state-owned broadcaster as flagrantly partisan as Zimbabwe's ZBC, Robert Mugabe's ZBC, although not everyone describes it that way.
Every other country in the world, be it South Africa, they have the South African Broadcasting Corporation, the British, they have the BBC, Australia is Australian Broadcasting Corporation. This is public media that is there to tell that particular country's story. ZBC is there to tell the Zimbabwean story.
They have been a ZANU-PF mouthpiece. There's no other way to describe it. The kind of adverts that they have been using.
These sellouts who are joining the whites who are murdering our people.
For ZANU-PF have been riddled with hate speech. Casting Morgan Tsvangirai as a sexual predator who is an awful person, and doing these amazing reports about how actually the West has been involved with Morgan Tsvangirai and how they have been using him as a puppet to instill regime change and ensure that there is some kind of white takeover in Zimbabwe.
ZBC has been broadcasting live all Mugabe's rallies, and they asked Morgan Tsvangirai to pay for coverage. They have been giving favorable coverage to ZANU-PF and demonizing Morgan Tsvangirai and his party. They've portrayed Mugabe as the saint and Morgan Tsvangirai as the devil.
There was a time in February 2009 when Zimbabweans were given reason to believe their media would change for the better. When President Mugabe and Morgan Tsvangirai formed their so-called unity government, that agreement promised comprehensive media reforms within 5 years, new licenses for privately owned newspapers, as well as radio and TV stations that would be editorially independent and would break the Mugabe media monopoly. 4.5 years later, not a single new TV license has been issued, and there have been just 2 new radio licenses allotted to ZFM and Star FM, and both are under the control of Mugabe loyalists. Government supporters still call that reform.
Oh yes, there have been a lot of media reforms. First of all, that there have been 60 publications, that there have been 2 daily news, that there have been 2 independent radio stations, that there are more than 8 weekly publications, newspapers. So there's been a lot of progress in terms of that.
ZANU had no intention of honoring the terms of that agreement. But I think they realized that, if they had implemented them fully, it might have affected their popularity. In Zimbabwe today, the dominant voice is the ZANU-PF voice.
The rogue element in the reporting of this election is a character who calls himself Baba Jukwa. His real identity is a mystery, but he's earned more than 300,000 likes on Facebook by exposing government secrets. Jukwa recently predicted the death of Edward Chininga, a former cabinet minister who had a public falling out with President Mugabe. Chininga was then killed in a car crash.
Naturally, this has freaked ZANU-PF out no end, mainly because he's providing what seems to be some very detailed information, including addresses and phone numbers of some top ZANU-PF officials who have complained that what's happening is actually putting them in danger and putting the lives of their families in danger. So there's a lot to be said about Baba Jukwa.
We have asked this question, and I ask again on air here, if anybody knows who Baba Jukwa is, please let us know as well. He is a character whom we've called the deep throat of ZANU-PF, because on all his postings he has been revealing the deep secrets of ZANU-PF. Who he is or who she is or who they are, we also would love to know.
Our Global Village Voices now on the Zimbabwean election and the news media.
The media environment in Zimbabwe, well, obviously it's polarized. You have the state media being controlled by President Robert Mugabe and his ZANU-PF party, and on the other side you have the independent media, which tends to sympathize with the opposition most of the time. But what we have seen is the emergence of a third new force, and that is the Citizen reporter.
The international media does not cover Zimbabwean politics in a fair and balanced manner. We have seen a notable improvement in the lives of ordinary Zimbabweans. Economic activity has picked up, especially in the mining and agricultural sectors. These are some of the stories that we as Africans would like the media to cover instead of focusing on the negative aspects of Zimbabwe.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. Bradley Manning has been found not guilty of aiding the enemy, but he will still probably spend the rest of his life in jail. Manning, the American soldier accused of the largest ever leak of secret U.S. government documents, was found guilty of 20 other charges, including espionage, theft, and computer fraud. Manning admits that he did leak the classified files to Wikileaks, but says his intention was to spark a debate on U.S. foreign policy and the true cost of war, not to threaten national security or endanger U.S. troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. The prosecution argued that with his intelligence training, Manning would have known that the secret information he leaked would reach al-Qaeda. Manning faces a maximum sentence of 136 years. The Manning verdict provoked an instant response from WikiLeaks' co-founder, Julian Assange, who remains at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Assange accused President Obama of national security extremism and, on the legal process, said the government kept Bradley Manning in a cage, stripped him naked, and isolated him in order to break him, an act formally condemned by the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Torture. This was never a fair trial. The Manning verdict coincided with the official launch of Assange's campaign for a Senate seat in Australia.
We have to improve the access and quality of information available to all Australians and to the world. That's why we've set up the WikiLeaks Party, and that's why I'm running this year for election.
Assange is seeking a seat in the state of Victoria. He is one of 7 WikiLeaks candidates vying for positions. Speaking via Skype to supporters at the WikiLeaks party launch in Melbourne, Assange said the party wants to address what he calls a decline in Australian democracy. The election is scheduled for September. It is not exactly clear how Assange will campaign while cornered in the embassy, where he's been for more than a year now because of a standoff between the British and Ecuadorian governments. So we put that question to him when we interviewed Assange 2 months ago. His response was, well, there's this thing called the internet. Between the Manning trial, the Edward Snowden story, the investigations of U.S. news outlets by the U.S. Justice Department, and the calling of a New York Times reporter to testify about his sources in a legal case, you would figure that the timing for the New York Times' first interview with President Obama in 3 years was just about perfect. The paper's Washington bureau chief, David Leonard, said that his reporters, Jackie Colmes and Michael Shear, had no restrictions on interview topics. However, they failed to ask a single question on whistleblowing and the administration's treatment of the media. Only 1 week ago, the paper's public editor, Margaret Sullivan, wrote about the legal hounding of a Times reporter, James Risen. Risen is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who could face jail time if he refuses to testify in the trial of Jeffrey Sterling, a former CIA officer charged with leaking classified information. The public editor, Sullivan, then addressed the Obama interview in a subsequent column, arguing that getting the president on the record on surveillance would have been newsworthy. But the D.C. bureau chief, David Leonard, said his reporters had a surveillance question on their list, but they didn't get to it. Here at the Listening Post, we've been keeping a close eye on how Turkey's media scene has been coping badly with the recent large-scale protests that rocked the government of Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan. For the first few days of the unrest, Turkish news channels and some newspapers provided little or no coverage. It was a flagrant example of the self-censorship that plagues Turkish journalism these days. One of the most outspoken critics of that trend has been veteran columnist Yavuz Bayder, calling out media owners for being too timid to put their business interests on the line for the sake of journalism. Now, Bayder has paid for his candor with his job. Yavuz Bayder was one of Turkey's first, and for a time only, ombudsperson, or reader's representative. In 2004, he took up the position with the newspaper Sabah, writing a regular column addressing media ethics in Turkey. Bayder has also worked with other newspapers and television channels, observing the mainstream media from the inside. After the Gezi Park protests erupted in Istanbul in late May, Baydar's editors at Sabah became uncomfortable with his criticism. Over the last month, 2 of his columns were censored, and after he wrote a fiery opinion piece for the New York Times on July 23rd, he was told to clear his desk. the Listening Post sent several requests to the editors of Sabah for comment on Baydar's dismissal. No one was made available to speak with us. Sabah has, however, made its position clear in the very same pages Baydar used to appear. In an article entitled "The Failure of Sabah's Ombudsman," Baydar was accused of breaking the rules and criticizing where he had no clearance to do so. Yavuz Bayder spoke to us from the city of Edremit in western Turkey. Yavuz Bayder, thanks for joining us at the Listening Post today.
Thank you.
Given the current media climate in Turkey, how surprised were you that Sabah fired you? What actually led to the firing, and was there a particular straw in your case that broke the camel's back?
It was kind of a step-by-step, brick-by-brick kind of escalation. It all depended on, naturally, of the deteriorating situation with the freedom of the speech and freedom of media ever since the last national elections 2011. I file my articles on Sundays, and Sunday afternoon was a very heavy traffic of communication, and editor not only censored the independent ombudsman column, but also attacked the ombudsman in his own column, which appeared the very day as he censored the ombudsman column. So this led to a measure that I took a leave and then came back after 2 weeks, filed another column, which was also refused. And 2 days after the second censorship, I was told that I was fired.
Just before you were fired, Sabah's editor-in-chief Erdal Safak published a piece quoting extensively from a reader's email in which the reader criticized you for attacking the paper's coverage. Did you think then that he was laying the groundwork for your eventual dismissal? And tell me what you think of the tactic of laying the criticism at the foot of the reader rather than taking a position himself publicly in the paper.
The job of the ombudsman is to pay attention to grounded critique, no matter from which vantage point this comes from, leftist and rightist and secular and conservative, etc. So this single reader reaction was basically accusing the ombudsman of being part of the conspiracy around the Gezi Park protests. And this, I think, was a pretty useful tool for editor-in-chief, who has actually, in his position, never been cooperative with the ombudsman and with the self-regulation mechanism that the Sabah had. So he used and abused this, and he chose to chastise the independent ombudsman of Sabah daily.
When you had one of your pieces spiked by your editor, and then you took that piece and published it in the New York Times, did you realize then that, for lack of a better term, by airing Turkey's dirty laundry in a foreign news outlet, that you were putting yourself in a position of significant risk that could eventually cost you your job?
Yes, I was aware of that. But that article was planned long ago. But I think everybody at that stage, in Turkey and elsewhere, in media circles, was aware how badly situation was getting out of hand in Turkey. And I gave many examples from the miscoverage, uncoverage of the urban protests in Turkey, particularly those TV channels and others. And that, of course, I think was the last nail in the coffin.
When you were fired, do you think that your firing was prompted by a phone call from a government official to one of your editors? Or do you think that in Turkey in 2013, such phone calls are even necessary from a government official?
I would not say, because I don't know whether or not, but as I put in my New York Times article, one doesn't even need such telephone calls or interventions from up above, from outside.
Now, last week, a newspaper called Zaman, that you still do some work for, published an article that said that 22 journalists in Turkey have lost their jobs since the beginning of the protests. 37 more have been forced to resign. Are we seeing a purge of what critical voices remain in the Turkish media?
As it seems now, and as indicated by the CPJ, Committee to Protect Journalists, etc., it is now being seen as if there's a cleansing going on in the sector. We should call it a purge. I think in the mid-run or in the long run will more public outrage, because they will see how lower the quality of the profession will be. This will, I think, put the public confidence to rock bottom.
What do you think lies at the heart of the problem in Turkey's media system? Is it, as we've reported before here at the Listening Post, that most media companies are owned by larger conglomerates And those conglomerates do so much business with the government that their media wings cannot afford to criticize that government.
The problem is, to make it simple, fourfold. First of all, 4 or 5, 6 major laws that has to do with the freedom of the press and freedom of the expression have to be reformed. Anti-terror law, internet law, press law, etc. Second, the laws must be changed that all the media proprietors who are in other businesses than media must be banned from entering public tenders. Third, collective rights for the journalists must be guaranteed. And fourth, there must be a new law change so that the TRT, which is a broadcaster, is no longer a state broadcaster but a public broadcaster. These 4 pillars are necessary and they have to be dealt in sync with each other so that Turkey's huge and increasing problems with the freedom and independence is dealt with properly and democratically.
Now, back in 2011, Prime Minister Erdogan called news bosses to a well-known meeting to tell them what kind of coverage he wanted to see in the media over a flare-up that was occurring at the time between government forces and Kurdish fighters. People who were in that meeting have told us that Prime Minister Erdogan did not have to say much, that the news editors were willing to go further on the government's behalf than Erdogan was even asking them to. Looking back at that meeting, was it a turning point of any kind, or was it just another step on the slippery slope in Turkey?
This, I think, showed Erdogan very clearly how willing media proprietors he had assembled at the table for a coalition with the government to limit the news and to censor the news. And this meeting was perceived by us at that time in the independent press as a turning point. And we pretty soon started seeing consequences of this. I started to express more and more my concern, not only in my column but outside. But again, the distinction is, as we know, some of my colleagues very well know, there are also very clear disagreements within the cabinet of AKP. Many ministers are almost as concerned as we are about the way the government is dealing with the media. This is only Mr. Erdogan's show.
Finally, what lies ahead for you now? Do you have a future in Turkish journalism, or is this it?
Turkish journalism has been marked by a culture of resistance and culture of dissent, resistance to limitations of freedom of expression, and dissent showing fairly what's right and what's wrong. Decade after decade, generation after generation, Journalist Corps of Turkey has continued this stance, and I can speak for myself. I will do my utmost to remain in this profession because I love this profession. Many of my colleagues love this profession, and we will find other ways, and we are hoping that we may seek new paths, new channels, particularly in the digital domain.
Yavuz Bayder, thanks for speaking to us at The Listening Post today.
Thank you.
Finally, we've all had to get used to those global positioning system devices, or GPSs, in our cars these days. They're always nattering away just above the dashboard, telling us to make a left here or make a right there. The team at collegehumor.com came up with the idea of pranking taxi passengers in New York by impersonating the computer-generated voice of the GPS and then getting personal. With more than 2.2 million hits online, the GPS prank is our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Take a right onto Kent Avenue. Take a left onto Greenpoint Avenue. I mean right. Take a right onto Greenpoint Avenue.
Wow, they make mistakes.
Continue straight onto Bedford Avenue. What is so interesting about that phone? Turn right onto What did you do to get her?
What did I just say? Turn right on.
It is my first day, can you tell? Did you buy that shirt in A, the 80s, B, the 80s, or C, the 80s? Turn right. Babe on board. So really, what did you do to get her?
See? I told you I'm not bugging. I told you I'm not bugging.
If I had knees, they would go weak for your smile. Did you just tweet? At least open the window if you tweet.
What's up with your thing, man?
Where did you get this from?
I can't believe I'm being dissed by a computer.
I want to hear an original song from your heart.
Sing a note and I'll harmonize with you.
GPS. You are great friends, but I can tell there is something in the air. Do the worm. You guys look stupid doing that. That is what I am talking about. You have made my day. This is actually a human being talking behind you in a car that is following you. Wave to us.